Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Welcome to our live audience here at Sprague Hall, as well as to our virtual viewers via live stream. I'm delighted to welcome you all here today to hear from David Shifrin, our beloved colleague, mentor, and teacher, on how to create opportunities throughout your career. I'm Astrid Baumgartner. I head up the Office of Career Strategies here at the Yale School of Music, as well as teach, and therefore I'm a colleague of David's. And I'm delighted to be joined in this conversation with students Christina Hughes, Sam Suggs, and Kevin Schaffner. Now, David Shifrin really needs no introduction to all of you, so I will only summarize the highlights of his wide-ranging and ever-evolving music career. As a performer, he has appeared as a soloist, recitalist, and chamber musician with the world's leading orchestras and ensembles throughout the world. A longtime member of the Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center since 1989, he collaborates widely with other musicians and ensembles. He's also very experienced as an artistic director. Since 1980, David has been the artistic director of the Chamber Music Northwest in Portland, Oregon, where he brings together the talents of up-and-coming stars with popular veteran players and creates wonderful concerts along with free outreach events and educational programs. At the Chamber Music Society, he served as its artistic director from 1992 to 2004, and also inaugurated CMS2, the Chamber Music Society's program for young chamber musicians. A faculty member at Yale since 1987, David is professor of clarinet and chamber music. He also serves as the artistic director of our Anepo Chamber Music Series, as well as the Yale in New York concert series. David's also been on the faculties of other leading conservatories and universities, including Juilliard, USC, the University of Michigan, and the Cleveland Institute of Music. He continues to broaden the opportunities for the clarinet repertoire by commissioning works from some of today's leading composers. And it's no surprise that in the year 2000, he was the winner of the Avery Fisher Prize, only one of two wind players to ever have won the prize since 1974. So we'll be hearing a lot more from David Shifrin about how he created all those opportunities and what you as today's young musicians can learn from this. But first I'd like to hear from our students, so please introduce yourselves and tell us how you know Mr. Shifrin.
Okay, hi, I'm Christina Hughes, and I'm a second-year master's student in flute performance. And last year, Mr. Shifrin was my chamber music coach for my wind quintet.
Hi, I'm Sam Suggs. I'm a doctoral student in double bass performance. I met Mr. Shifrin about a year and a half ago. I played an arrangement with my chamber group. We were doing Italian Algiers as an arrangement for my Prokofiev quintet, and Mr. Shifrin was at the event, and later on, we've collaborated at Chamber Music Northwest through the Protégé program and a few other festivals.
Great. Kevin.
My name is Kevin Schaffner. I'm a second-year master's student and a current student of Mr. Shifrin's. My very first encounter, I guess, was when I was 12, when someone gave me your Brahms quintet recording with Emerson, and I've been listening to it almost every day since then.
You were 12?
That's great. So the five of us will be conversing for a while, and then I'm going to open up the floor to questions from the audience. So let's begin by asking you, David. You've had such a wide-ranging performer as a performer, an artistic director, a festival director, and a professor. How did you decide to even become a musician and a clarinetist?
Oh, that's a good question.
Start
if
from
I
the
can
beginning.
remember.
Yeah.
Well, I grew up in Queens, outer borough, New York City, and there was not really a distinction about whether you were a musician or you played sports. You played stickball in the street and you played a musical instrument. It was just many activities interchangeable, and I had some friends that I used to play ball with, one who played the flute, one who played the cello. I thought, well, I'd like to play an instrument like my friends. It was that simple. I chose the clarinet because I saw the movie, The Benny Goodman Story. and that helped me decide which instrument.
Nice. And I know that you attended the Interlochen camp and then attended their boarding school. So what were some of the highlights that shaped you as a musician from that experience at Interlochen?
Well, I think the first one was going to a music camp at age 13, living up there with hundreds of other kids who were all really serious about playing instruments, but did not exclude other activities. They were normal kids, at least in my perception, who were really passionate about music. And that made it okay for me to feel that way, I felt. And I remember deciding at that age, at Interlochen, that if you could do this for a living or as a job, wouldn't that be great? It'd be so much better than working.
Great. So what were some of your favorite experiences at Interlochen?
The experiences were hearing people who played much, much better than I did. and being around really world-famous musicians. It was incredible. The Philadelphia Orchestra came to Interlochen. Van Cliburn came up and played concertos with the kids conducting. You know, our own faculty member, Ani Kavafian, was there at the same time, and she conducted the Philadelphia Orchestra on one of those concerts. I'm embarrassed my colleague, but it was a tradition that after every concert, the orchestra would play the theme from Howard Hanson's Second Symphony. He had been a big part of the founding of Interlochen, and that the concertmaster of the orchestra would conduct. And on this occasion, they had the Philadelphia Orchestra play, but they had Ani, who was the concertmaster of the student orchestra, conduct. Great. So seeing your friends and people your own age having experiences like this and having the opportunity to really focus on what you're doing made a big difference for me. They had a system then, which I think no longer exists, called Challenges, which is very controversial. Because there were auditions every single week, and it was very competitive for each chair in the orchestras and the bands. And if you were last chair, you had the opportunity to challenge the other players. And it could be a very intimidating and stressful situation. It was also an opportunity and an incentive for people to really work harder. So we were all practicing very hard.
Wow. And didn't you tell us that at one point you switched to the saxophone?
Well, I wasn't doing very well on the clarinet. There were some great players there, like Frank Cohen, who's still principal in the Cleveland Orchestra, came right after me to that job, and he was first chair in the high school orchestra, and Lauren Levy, who played for many years in the Los Angeles Philharmonic, was there, and I was way down the totem pole, and I wanted to play. So I looked at what the opportunities that were available, and saw that the repertoire involved a lot of saxophone, pieces like Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, and Prokofiev's Romeo and Juliet that had orchestral saxophone. So there weren't that many saxophone players. So I took up the saxophone and practiced really hard and got to do a lot more playing that way.
And what brought you back to clarinet?
The saxophone teacher, Donald Cinta, who was a great colleague and mentor over the years, and who was my teacher that summer of saxophone, convinced me that the repertoire was stronger for the clarinet.
Great.
So
yeah,
I went back.
And I know that you did a lot of performing and touring when you were at Interlochen.
Well, that was a great model in those days for showing kids what it's like to be a musician, because they put us on the road. We played a different orchestral concert every week, and got in a bus and played in all the small towns in Michigan, went down to Chicago, played in Orchestra Hall, came to New York, played in Carnegie Hall and Kennedy Center in Washington. So for kids to have that kind of opportunity and experience at that age kind of demystified what the concert life was like. And I think a lot of the kids who went through that were able to deal with some of the stresses and stage frights. And I think others found that experience helped them decide not to go into music. It was exposure at an early age.
Right. So you obviously decided to continue your studies and you went to Curtis.
I did.
So I know one story you told me I'd love for you to tell the group is how you started your first ensemble.
Well, I told you about, you're good at these questions. You really. The experience at Interlochen was so intense, and there were so many playing opportunities, that when I went to Curtis, which is one of the great conservatories in the world, I felt like I didn't have anything to do, except practice, of course. And my lessons were great, but there was a very strict seniority system at the time. And being a freshman, I didn't get to play in the orchestra very much or in the woodwind chamber music class. And I was just itching to do more, so I found that there were several others in my position who felt that way, so we would get together and play chamber music. Had the police come to my apartment one night after midnight, we were playing Mozart wind serenades, and the neighbors had complained that we created a disturbance. So people love chamber music, but maybe not in every situation. I thought it would be nice to do more of this, and I was working at the time as an usher at the Academy of Music for the Philadelphia Orchestra concerts to make some extra money, and at a music publisher, a fellow named Al Boss had one of these presses that used to print music on onion skin paper. It used ammonia. They don't do that anymore, but he was hiring students to help in there, and you spent all day when you were working with this terrible smelling printing press of ammonia. And that's how, if you have any of the old music that was printed in the 60s and 70s, you can almost still smell that ammonia on the parts. So I was looking for other ways to make some money and play the clarinet. And I got the idea to get some stationery printed up with the name of a woodwind quintet that we took from the street or the square outside of the Curtis Institute and called it the Rittenhouse Quintet. And I got 4 of my colleagues together. And I got a catalog of chamber music presenters in the eastern states and got the stationery together and wrote letters. Said, we have one of the greatest woodwind quintets of the next generation, now available for touring next season. And I sent about 100 of these letters, and lo and behold, many of them were not answered. Got a couple of polite rejections, and I got a few letters back saying, yes, we'd like to engage your quintet. And that was my first professional experience as a manager and as a chamber music performer.
Right.
We went to some colleges, and it was really quite a astounding experience. I really didn't expect that much to come of it.
Well, so what's great in this is that you just tried, and like a lot of people today, you tried 100 things and got few responses. And so I guess early on you were able to deal with the fact of a musician's life, which is how to manage rejection.
Oh, yeah. For all the auditions that I think any of us have succeeded in, we don't really chronicle all the ones where we've been turned away.
Right.
Was your success with creating the ensemble at Curtis an affirmation of your first taste of entrepreneurship? Like, did it plant a seed in the back of your head for the rest of your career?
Well, I did remember that for the future. I tucked it away, and it's certainly something that we all learn. There's a certain amount of I suppose of sales that anybody in any career or any profession has to engage in. It can be subtle, it can be unconscious, but you can be very gifted, very talented, but unless you let people know that you're interested in doing what you do, and that you're available to do what you do, and that you are reliable to do what you say you can do and show up, you have to get that message out somehow. We all do. I'm very, very impressed with some of the initiatives that I've seen here at Yale, the Cantata Profana group that has come together and plays so well together and is really organized. David Perry, who was in the clarinet studio a couple of years ago, has started this second movement group. Sam here has his jazz trio and is really quite an entrepreneur, doing other things, is a wonderful composer. You told me today you're writing some music for the Yale Cabaret. If you feel like you can do something and it's something that interests you, you have to find ways to make it happen.
So it's really interesting because you told me that you were told by your teachers that one could not make a living as a chamber musician. So then you decided to pursue the audition route and get an orchestral career going. So tell us a little about your early years in orchestra.
Oh, well, as a student at Curtis and at various summer festivals studying with other teachers, I would audition for the concerto contests and try to play chamber music in recitals, and would tell my teachers that that's what I wanted to do for a living, and they'd say, well, that's really great, and you probably get some opportunities as long as you have a job in an orchestra and a way to make a living. So I took that very seriously and practiced very hard and took those orchestral auditions, and wound up doing that for a few years. And I enjoy that music very much, but it's nice to have a wide range of experience as well.
Right. So how did you make the switch from your orchestral career to the next phase of your career?
Well, things progressed very quickly for me in orchestral playing. Stokowski's Orchestra, American Symphony, and then the Honolulu Symphony. And that was really a big decision to move all the way out there, and it was probably an even bigger decision to leave. It's such a beautiful place. Mm-hmm. I came back to Dallas and played in the Dallas Symphony for a while, and then was very fortunate to win the principal job in the Cleveland Orchestra. But I was really too young for that. I was the only principal win that Lauren Mazel had hired thus far in the orchestra, and was at least 20 years younger than all of the other players. And I was really quite in awe of them. I had studied there in the summertime, and it was just overwhelming to be doing all of that repertoire. And I think for Mazel, he was pretty new in the orchestra then too. He had this incredibly long, illustrious career, but that was a new job for the maestro, and I think he was under a lot of pressure. And the one person that he had hired in the wind section that he could hold most accountable was me, and I felt a lot of pressure, and I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to continue. After a couple of seasons, I had an amazing opportunity, an offer to teach at the University of Michigan and to have freedom to play concerts, just as the faculty at most music schools, including Yale, have to meet your teaching schedule and find ways to be a performer, be a composer, express yourself musically. Faculty members are encouraged to publish or perform, record, and that was the case at Michigan. And at that stage in my life, I thought, well, I can still try to follow my earlier aspirations to have a different kind of a career as a clarinetist. I was still in my 20s, so I was able to go to some international competitions and had a lot more time to practice. Mm-hmm. And so it was a complete 180 from having a schedule that was given a year in advance where you knew where you were going to be rehearsing, what piece you were going to play, what time your breaks were going to be, what time to get on the bus, what time your meal was going to be, for the entire year, every day of the year, as a member of an orchestra, to having the opportunity to make my own schedule and the responsibility to make my own opportunities. And it was very, very informative and formative at the same time.
Well, it sounds like you enjoy your freedom and having artistic license, which I think is an important characteristic of a lot of successful musicians today, is you figure out what you're all about and how you can align your career with that. And it sounds like you've done a really good job in being able to do that and laying the seeds in Michigan, where I believe you created your first concert series.
Well, things didn't progress quite as quickly as I would have liked. I wanted to be playing more in the first couple of years, so I thought, well, let's put on a show. I remember all those Mickey Rooney movies. Let's put on a show. The dean at the time was very helpful and supportive, and assigned a work study student to help me form a series, and other faculty members at Michigan and members of the Detroit Symphony, which is only an hour's drive away from Ann Arbor, colleagues in the Toledo Symphony, which is also an hour away, Bowling Green University. I remember pianist Paul Schoenfield, a great composer, was on the piano faculty at the University of Toledo then, and we gathered musicians together at the student union and put on a series of chamber music concerts that was very well received and was very enjoyable.
I'm just really curious to hear about how you dealt with having so much success at a young age. Because I remember reading you were playing with the American Symphony Orchestra at age 20. At 21, you were teaching at the University of Honolulu. And shortly after, you were in the Cleveland Orchestra. So what was it like teaching students close to your age? And
Oh, that was an interesting phenomenon. Actually, still to this day, one of the most incredible experiences was being thrust into the role of a teacher. Principal players in orchestras are often asked to teach at the local music school or university when they're given the orchestral position. And that was far more daunting to me than playing in the orchestra or playing the clarinet. It was, what am I supposed to tell these people? I remember calling my former teacher, Fred Ormond, who had been my teacher at the Interlochen Arts Academy, and saying, what should I do? What am I supposed to tell these kids? He said, oh, you listen to them, you'll know, and remember remember what you were taught by your teachers. And I enjoyed it so much, I became good friends with a lot of my students who were my own age. And it was a unique situation. That is the University of Hawaii, the Manoa campus in Honolulu. It's a beautiful place. You are isolated in Honolulu, and that can be a difficult situation, but it can also be an opportunity for a young teacher just starting out, because I had such talented students. It was very rare that the students would go off the island for their undergraduate work. So the most talented kids were still there in Honolulu. And I went back 20, 25 years later, and they were, many of them were the band directors of all the high schools in Honolulu. And they had chosen that for their career, and were playing occasionally with the Honolulu Symphony. We're playing in all of the clubs in Waikiki. It's not a place that people really want to leave. And so there was a lot of talent there who had grown up there and stayed. And that was the case in the student population as well. So it was very lucky for me to get to work with talented students right from the beginning of my teaching career.
Now go ahead.
Could you talk a little bit about the difference between teaching then and now? And the structure.
My teaching, or how?
As you see the institution of teaching music then as it is compared to now.
Oh, I think it's always been such an individual thing. If there's any major difference in teaching the playing of an instrument, is that I think most of the people I know now are less dogmatic than when I was a student. And not to criticize my teachers, but I studied with a few teachers who were extremely convinced that there was one way to produce a sound on the instrument, one type of equipment to use, a specific tempo for every major piece of repertoire, articulation that was absolute, and this was the way it was done, and that was the way they had learned. I think that, of course, when I was a student, there were already long-playing records, and radio, and television, but since then, it's the proliferation of the availability of ideas and different styles and different ways of teaching, certainly with the internet, and is that every student can find out other ways than what you're telling them. So you need to justify, a teacher needs to at least have a good reason for asking a student to do things a certain way, and for listening and examining other ideas. So I think the teaching of a art form and a practice that's been around for hundreds of years has evolved in the same way that every other access to information and history has.
It's really interesting that you talk about yourself as a teacher and your own teachers. So maybe tell us a little about your mentors. They sound like they were important to you.
Oh. I had a few really wonderful teachers. My first clarinet teacher was the junior high school music teacher, a man named Lewis Carroll. Spelled it differently than the author. But he conducted the orchestra in our junior high school and taught private lessons to all the kids in the neighborhood, every instrument. And he just loved music, and he loved working with kids. And was a great mentor to, I think I was 10 years old, 9 or 10 years old, to me, and I saw how he was with other students as well. And he was the one who suggested that I go to the National Music Camp at Interlochen, and told me about the Curtis Institute of Music, which my parents were delighted with, because Curtis was a full scholarship school, right, years before Yale was. So he was a great mentor. And then at Interlochen, my teachers, Herbert Blayman, who was the principal clarinetist in the Metropolitan Opera, was my teacher at Interlochen in the summer. And then when I came back from the summer camp, I worked with him in New York as a high school student, and then went back to Interlochen full-time. Studied with Fred Ormond, who is still a close friend and a mentor, somebody that I call for advice about teaching. Donald Cinta, the saxophonist at Michigan, who I mentioned a few times, were great influences. My teachers, Anthony Gigliotti at Curtis, and John Delancey, who conducted the wind class every single week at Curtis, wind chamber music. And Robert Marcellus, who for many of us still is the ideal clarinet tone that we all tried to emulate, who had been in the Cleveland Orchestra from the 1950s to the 1970s.
And I know you serve as mentors for lots of young people here and elsewhere. So how should young musicians go about trying to cultivate mentorship relationships?
How should the young musicians? Well, by doing what they do and exhibiting a certain level of initiative, as these three can attest. I'd love to hear about some of the things that you three are doing. I know Sam and his arranging and composing and his jazz, and he found another outlet for his creativity by playing the accordion as a virtuoso, and is not shy to to exhibit that. I know that Kevin has one of the most unusual backgrounds for a young man that I've ever known, having lived in so many diverse places. Kyrgyzstan, Laos, was it Romania? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Your parents Kevin's parents work for UNICEF, and you've grown up all over the world. And I'd like to know from you first of all, how you've kept your focus in being a clarinetist, because you have a great focus and real commitment to the instrument, living in all of these diverse cultures, and how that has affected how you have shared that with the world. Because I know you've done some things in Central America and helped bring instruments to kids who need them in different countries and taught.
Yeah, well, the year I started clarinet, my family happened to be living in Romania, which was a great place to start any instrument because it had a rich tradition of classical music, and I was studying with great teachers. So I had 2 great years of clarinet study there. And then my family moved to India, where it was the polar opposite. It was a desert in terms of Western
music.
But,
Right.
you know, they have incredible, very, very rich traditional system of music that's very advanced and just amazing.
Did you involve yourself in...
I tried to, but it's so different that it was, you know...
How old were you at that point?
At that point, I was about 12, 13. So at that point, I sort of had to make the decision whether or not to stay in India, maybe go take a different path because I wasn't really learning anything with clarinet, or go to the Interlochen Arts Academy and study music.
Yeah.
And so I ended up doing that. But the experience of living in India, first of all, there were no teachers, and also it was very, very difficult to buy any sort of equipment for the clarinet. Reeds, mouthpieces.
Are there no symphonies?
There is now in Bombay, but back then, not really. So that led me to the idea of creating an organization that brought instruments and teachers to countries where kids may not have access to those 2 things. So so the
and you're still doing that?
Yeah.
But not during the school year?
All the time.
That's great.
Yeah, no, it's great. Wonderful.
Christina, this is your 2nd year here at Yale.
Yes.
And you were at New England Conservatory?
Yes, I went to New England Conservatory for undergrad.
Where else have you lived and performed?
Well, I guess this is sort of related to Kevin. Last summer, in 2013, I went to Kenya with a wind quintet, and we
How did that come about?
My friend Midori Sampson, she's a bassoonist. She went to Juilliard, and she's really interested in community outreach, and she's extremely proactive. And a group of dancers would usually go to Tanzania, and 2 of them met someone after a performance and brought them to this school that he owned in a slum of Nairobi. And they performed there, and they wanted to go back with their dance group, but they couldn't, they weren't able to get there. So they passed off the group to Midori, and Midori kind of pulled together some friends, and she told me I'm the only flutist she could travel across the globe with. And so we were there for 3 weeks, mainly 2 weeks teaching in a slum at a school that doesn't have a music program. And then we also taught at a couple of other schools that did have music programs, but instruments there are really rare and very expensive. So I know we were talking with Kevin because we're planning on returning. So.
Right.
Fantastic. Did they respond well to the music that you played?
I think so. I mean, a lot of it was pretty different. I mean, we also were playing so much wind quintet repertoire is 20th century, so if they'd ever heard something classical, it was something more traditional. But we even played actually in a Maasai village because we had a couple, 3 days off. And one day we went on a safari and we stopped in a Maasai village, and you can go around, and we brought our instruments and we played lickety for them. They thought it was really bizarre. And they held our music for us because we didn't have stands.
So, no, but it's fascinating to hear about these different types of opportunities that the young musicians are pursuing in community outreach. And I think you've had that experience in Portland. So maybe you can tell us a little about your role there.
Well, I feel like I've grown up with that experience in Portland. I started going there at a pretty early age. I was in my 20s, and I've gone there every summer since. And my predecessor in Portland at Chamber Music Northwest was a violinist from Romania named Sergiu Luca, who had been on tour in Portland and found that the audience really loved the chamber music, and arranged with some of the pillars of the community to raise some money to have a few concerts, and it grew into a festival that exists now, where we have concerts almost every single night for 5 weeks, and people attend them. Sam was part of that last summer. And part of that effort has been to become a part of that community, in the sense that we meet the youngsters who are playing instruments, and they can come to rehearsals. We coach some of them. Sam was involved with a lot of those things. You went to the community music school, and
yeah, we did some outreach programs. We taught at one of the local string schools, and we did a bunch of concerts in clubs. And
we did.
In a jazz club and an old movie theater that was retrofitted.
I love chamber music for many reasons. The incredible depth of repertoire, the inexhaustible supply of masterpieces that we get to play, but it's so portable. We can go into schools, you can go into a Maasai village, you can go into a nightclub, and sometimes want to tailor the repertoire to the venue. But chamber music is a great way to reach out, to use that as it's become kind of a cliche, outreach, but we hear so often about the curtailment of funds for arts education, music education in the schools, and the aging of audiences for the arts and for classical music in particular. And much of the responsibility is then put on the performers. Say, well, if you want to perform classical music, you have to find your audience and cultivate them. And so all of these kinds of experiences on a global level are very, very important. And they're completely worthwhile. It's quite extraordinary that anybody would have any doubt that classical music will be here for centuries. It's pretty great stuff, and those of us who believe in it are going to keep doing it and make opportunities for that.
Well, and what I love is how you actually created a chamber music career. So they said you couldn't, and you did it. And so we have, you were at Michigan, you got all your friends together to play. By the way, tell us more about that, because it seems like you've met some interesting people early on in your career who still continue to be in your professional and personal life. I mean, you mentioned Ani Kavafian, but there are several others, aren't there?
Well, we talk about these global experiences, but the world of classical music is not that big. And the people who you meet who are meaningful in your life and with whom you work tend to show up in different places. Some of the musicians that I've worked with for decades, and who are Americans, I've met at festivals in Europe. And some of the musicians that I went to music camp with in the 1960s, I would lose touch with, and then see at another music festival or at Lincoln Center when we were put together to play in a group at Alice Tully Hall. And so it keeps coming around. And being a performer who tours, as we all do, it is a way to keep the community of musicians intact, people that I went to school with. My roommate, I think about my friend Jan Sloman was my roommate at Curtis. We shared an apartment on the 5th floor walk up over an antique store. And he went and got a job as the associate concertmaster of the Dallas Symphony, years after I was in the orchestra. And ordinarily, that would probably be the most you would do these days is see a friend on Facebook or send a Christmas card. But being a musician and touring, it's an opportunity to keep this extended family almost of friends intact, because sooner or later you're in town or you're in a place that you don't think you know anyone, and after the performance you see, wait a minute, oh my gosh, it's you. That happens all the time.
Well, isn't that how you got to Chamber Music Society of Lincoln Center?
Well, you mentioned that earlier. Coming to Portland, Oregon from the University of Michigan and playing in ensembles, I saw musicians that I had known as a camper at Interlochen and hadn't seen for years, and rekindled old friendships, met some new friends. Fred Sherry, the cellist, was playing there when I first started, and a few years later he was directing the group at Lincoln Center, the Chamber Music Society, and wound up asking me to come and play there. And then when I was the director, I asked him to play, and there is a lot of that. You tend to work with people who you know and trust and admire, and there's a kind of a larger repertory company of chamber musicians who go from festivals to festival and series to series, and it sometimes involves entire ensembles that work with other ensembles and individuals. But I've sometimes tried to calculate how many musicians I know who earn their primary living from playing chamber music, and I think there are a few hundred that I know of, and that's probably it. So you do tend to stay in touch. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of Americans. I'm sure, there's a whole, it's interesting how there are such amazing musicians in Europe as well, and we don't see each other that often, especially and regrettably since 2001, because it's much more difficult to tour internationally, especially for musicians from other countries and performers from other countries to come to this country. Right. Since Homeland Security and protection is so stringent.
So, go ahead.
I had a question about just with festivals, or how you got that opportunity with the Chamber Music Society. You asked your friends to play in festivals you began, or they asked you. Have you ever had to what extent have you had a trying experience in an ensemble that tested your ability to remain professional and then even stay friends outside of the rehearsal room?
Oh, that's a hard question to answer publicly. Generally speaking, there are a number of reasons that people will want to work together, and it's based on past experience being productive and pleasant. And so, generally, I've had wonderful experiences with most of the musicians I've had the opportunity to work with. And but chamber music rehearsals are probably as close in the arts as we come to group therapy. and we're always describing chamber music as music with one on a part, music without a conductor, democratically conceived and collaboratively prepared. And so that I think experienced chamber musicians who have some longevity in their careers learn a certain diplomacy, the way politicians and people have to learn that there's a certain language of discourse in working together. And then who you go out and have a drink with after the rehearsal or the concert is your own business. But I think in professional situations, if you're going to be able to have a career that lasts, that's important to learn how to work with others. There are some great musicians who somehow are not suited to that, who may have great solo careers or can play chamber music in certain situations where they're the leader and it's understood. And if you accept a position or an opportunity to play in a concert with somebody who's clearly an alpha leader in a chamber ensemble, that you know that that's what you're getting into. So it's always wise to understand what kind of situation you're agreeing to be in, rather than go into it and find out later and react poorly to that situation.
Also, in addition...
In other words, I'm not going to tell you about this fight or that fight that happened 20 years ago.
That's fine. But in addition to being productive and pleasant, is there any other advice you have for trying to secure a future opportunity with someone you're working with, like in a current situation?
Yeah, come prepared. There's nothing that's more annoying to a chamber musician than to have a really gifted player come to rehearsal and not know their part. We talk about having lots and lots of rehearsals for concerts and how that is what's going to make it great. But it's far more important that everybody who comes to the first rehearsal has looked at the score, has studied it, hopefully exposed themselves to different interpretations of a work, and really learn their part before the first rehearsal. Of course, with new music, that's impossible. And some of the most stressful situations that I've been in have been in world premieres, where the music has not been delivered in a timely fashion. And we have this trust between performers and composers. Composers out there, I love you, but please try to get the piece done in time for us to prepare it, to do the best service for you.
Well, what is your experience in commissioning new works? Because I know, you have quite a wide repertoire that you work with, but you do commission works from today's composers. So tell us some of your favorite experiences there.
Well, after saying what I just said...
The guy who's prepared, right? Or the woman.
With so many composers, it's really worth it. It's really worth it, no matter how stressful it is. I did a tour about 15 years ago with Wynton Marsalis, where we did Stravinsky's Soldier's Tale and a companion piece that Wynton wrote. And he's a busy guy. He's been busy for a long time, yet he wrote this hour-long theater piece to go with Stravinsky's Soldier's Tale. And he was still writing on the road. We'd play one night, and then the next day, he would hand out some sheets and say, "This movement is different tonight." But that really kept you on your toes. And of course, when a composer is that high a level performer too, you want to take it seriously. I think I've had similar experiences with Edgar Meyer, the bass player composer, and some other wonderful composers. It's interesting how there are composers who seem to hand you the score the day after you commission a work, and others who hand it to you the day after the first performance, the next edition. And everyone has their own working rhythms, and it really is not a reflection on whether a composer is good or not a good composer. but it does impact how secure a performer is with preparing the performance. I've been really lucky to be in a position many times to allocate resources to composers to write new music, not just for the clarinet, but for the chamber music organizations that I worked with. Early on, I wanted to expand the repertoire for clarinet and orchestra. We have a wonderful repertoire, but it's not enormous. Compared to the violin or the piano, it's minuscule with a few masterpieces. So it's inspired by people in the 20th century, most notably Benny Goodman, who commissioned all the major composers of his day to write music for the clarinet, and some great concertos, notably the Copland concerto, Hindemith's concerto, which he wrote mostly while Hindemith was here at Yale, and which I think was a big part of why Benny Goodman had a relationship with Yale and donated his papers to this university. It's an inspiration to those of us who have opportunities to perform to try to expand the repertoire. And so I was blessed with having some really good advisors and managers at IMG, artists more than 20 years ago, who steered me in the direction of places where you could apply for grant funding to commission works. When I received a chunk of cash from the Avery Fisher career grant, which was the first one I got, I put it towards commissioning music for the clarinet. So I've had those opportunities, and through Chamber Music Northwest in Portland, we have been commissioning a few new works every year. Sam mentioned the audience out there, and the supporters are very much an enlightened group who believe in music as a living, breathing organism, and have made funds available to commission new works. And so it's a big responsibility to be the person who decides which composer is going to be the next one commissioned, and it's really quite an adventure.
So you mentioned Yale a few times. Tell us about your experience of teaching at Yale, since you've had the experience of being on a number of other faculties. What's special about Yale?
Well, while the subject of composers is still fresh, I say that Yale is an extraordinary place from so many aspects, but I don't know of another school in the world that has the strength and the depth in the composition department that this school has. We've a high percentage of composers whose works are performed by major artists and ensembles, winning all the major prizes, the Pulitzer Prizes and the Ives Awards and the American Academy. It's just extraordinary what a depth of talent we have at this institution. I came to teach here in 1987, and I left another great institution and taught at other universities and music schools before that, but I've never had an experience that comes close to the experience I have at Yale. And there are a few reasons for that. One is the commitment that we have to excellence. The other is the resources that the university has, and the extraordinary development about a decade ago of being able to recruit students who don't have to pay tuition. But probably the most important thing is the size and proportion, at least in my view. That the fact that it's a graduate school and that we have 6 clarinetists that have really learned how to play their instrument before they come, and have demonstrated a commitment and an ability to enter the profession. It gives us the opportunity as a graduate school in performance to work on repertoire, to work on refinement, and to work on establishing the groundwork for beginning a career as a professional performer. When I taught at schools where there were 45 clarinetists in the school, I could really relate to how many of them felt, because I always wanted, when I was a young musician, I wanted to play. And it's hard to find opportunities for so many students, and even harder for them to prepare for what is a very competitive life in music. At Yale, the proportions are wonderful, like this auditorium that we're in. I love this hall. I love the size of the stage, and that there's 600 to 700 seats in the hall. I might be off by a few. And you could almost reach out and touch everyone. And the school, the music school, you get to know almost everybody in the school, and everybody is working towards some kind of community in music. It's a great experience.
Mm-hmm. And of course, you're artistic director of the Chamber Music Series here, as well as the Yale and New York Series. And of course, you mentioned your experience with l'Histoire du Soldat, but you did that fantastic collaboration with the Yale Drama School last year, which personally I found one of the most thrilling things I've been to in a long time.
Well, that was one of the most thrilling things I've been to in a long time, too. And it's because we're in a community with such amazing talent and resources, and we were able to work together with a director like Elizabeth Diamond from the Yale Drama School, who directed the dramatic part, and a choreographer like Emily Coates, so all on the Yale faculty. And then we had Robert Blocker as Dean of the School of Music and James Bundy as Dean of the School of Drama, agreeing to work together and pool our resources. It was an extraordinary thing. We planned it for almost 2 years. Liz is fluent in French and took it upon herself to make a new translation, an updated translation of Rameau's original libretto for the play. And it really is a dramatic work, it's a dance work, and it's a musical work that was born because of political and social upheaval in Europe, and we were able to recreate that, this theater company that was only able to happen because we could all work together across disciplines here on campus. That's difficult. Of course it happens. That's one of the most often performed works of its kind throughout the world. But this was really special. We started rehearsing in January for performance in April. You know, for those of us in the profession who I'll have a concerto appearance with an orchestra, and I'll get there the day before, and really lucky to have 2 rehearsals. Or even at Lincoln Center, when we play chamber music, we try to have lots and lots of rehearsal, but usually 4 days ahead of time. We'll have full days of rehearsal for 4 days and then play a performance. But being here at Yale with really professional level students and a couple of faculty members and alums performing in this, and really working and watching how actors and theater directors and producers work to make the totality of this, and seeing a choreographer like Emily Coates teaching actors how to move and dance over this extended period of rehearsal time was an experience that you don't usually have outside of this kind of a community.
It seems like your career path has led you to be in a place that allows you to do exactly what you want to do, when you want to do it, not just here at Yale, but also in the different music festivals that you direct. I'm just wondering, so much of your career has this cascading effect where one thing led to another. I'm just wondering, can you pinpoint a specific time or opportunity that sort of got the dominoes falling, or several key moments early in your career?
you really never know what's around each corner. And I wish I had that kind of vision where I could tell that this is going to lead to that. In retrospect, I think that starting that little festival at Michigan and then having the opportunity to perform in Portland, and then being given the opportunity to make the programs for this festival and see it grow. It was just lucky for me that everything was just right. It lined up very well. It was at a time when the city of Portland was growing, and the cultural life was increasing, and the festival's role in that community was growing as I was learning my trade, and it's something that has meant a great deal to me artistically. And then coming to Yale and having this as my home base professionally has just allowed me as a musician and as a teacher to sustain and grow.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Avery Fisher, and I know you've won some other competitions. How did that factor into your career? How did it give you opportunities? Or
awards and competition prizes are really great to have, but I find that there's kind of a limited shelf life. You know, I was really, really happy about winning every audition that I have won and tried to forget about the ones that I didn't win. And I learned from having some success that one thing leads to one thing, and then maybe another. And you have to look beyond it. I've seen colleagues who will win a prize and have a tremendous boost to their activity for a limited period of time, and then when that expires, unless they've kind of linked that to other opportunities or broadened the horizon, the danger is that it has a trajectory and then it's over. Joe Silverstein, the former concertmaster of the Boston Symphony, great violinist, conductor, was one of the violinists that I worked with for many years at Lincoln Center, and was kind of a mentor to me. I met him when I was a student at the music festival in Sarasota, Florida, which still is I think he still goes there every year.
Does.
And you know, Joe had this description of the trajectory of a performer's career in classical music. He said, there's the rising star and the living legend. And in between is the valley of despair. and I think the rising star is always well advised to think how they're going to deal with their lives when they land back on Earth.
Do you have any advice to young musicians that want to start music festivals now, or do you feel like there's any sort of audience or demographic that needs to be reached?
It's not rocket science. It's just a lot of work. You know, in the libretto for The Soldier's Tale, there is a line that Joe, the soldier, recites when he's parlaying all his success from this magic book that tells him how to achieve untold riches and wealth. He said, well, then I became a businessman, and it was easy. I just found out what people wanted, and I sold it to them, or something like that. But you do have to think about what's important, what you want to contribute, and then find out or where you can do it. Find a venue, find out people who are like-minded and want to help you and join you, and then you have to do it. Many successful series have started in churches, in schools. I'm sure that an ensemble that we all just think just exists on the radio and on CD covers like the Academy of St. Martin in the Fields has just always been there on the radio, but I think it was a bunch of musicians getting together in a church in London and playing some chamber music and larger chamber orchestra type things. Things get started that way. Occasionally there'll be, a few philanthropists who start something like Lincoln Center and decide that there should be a component and make available all of the necessary resources to a group of musicians, and just you have this great gift. But as I said earlier, chamber music is portable and flexible, and you can do it in your living room. Invite a few friends over. And now you have Kickstarter and all of these other opportunities on the internet to raise funds for things that are meaningful to you, that are only limited by your energy and imagination.
Do you see chamber music playing a larger part in the future of classical music?
A larger part?
Well, I mean, it does now, but with the state of orchestras.
Well, I think that's been a trend for many years, many centuries actually. So many composers have written their most profound works for chamber ensembles, at least partially because there's the most control over a small group. A composer will... Look, we just had a performance here the other night of Mahler's Second Symphony, which is spectacular and visceral and wonderful. But most composers might have a difficult time getting a performance of a work for 100 people, like that. But composers have written so much great music for small groups, and accordingly, the resources to produce these masterpieces from centuries are manageable. You can put on a concert of Brahms sonatas or Bach concerti in a living room or a small church or a classroom, and the economics of it and the production values are within reach, so that chamber music has always been an important part of musical lives, and I think always will be. And I think that groups like the Chamber Music Society, festivals like Chamber Music Northwest in Portland, the Santa Fe Chamber Music Festival, Music at Menlo, the Marlborough Festival in Vermont, have borne this out in the last generation, that the highest quality of music, the most compelling music with the top performers performing it, is available in a smaller scale at a time that sometimes orchestras are having difficulty making their payrolls and paying their bills, and chamber music can survive that.
Well, you've programmed for so many different festivals and so many different types of audiences. What do you see as what today's audiences are looking for?
It's hard to generalize what audiences are looking for, but the most common trend is that people are looking for what's familiar to them. People will buy tickets for things they've heard on the radio or heard when they were growing up. There's usually a reason that a war horse is a war horse, and that's usually used in a derogatory way. But so many of the works that have endured and that people buy tickets to hear are there because they're great. And I have found in programming that when you program a great work of Schubert or Brahms or Mozart or Bach, that more people will buy tickets than when you program Spohr and Hummel and Buxtehude. There's some amazing music that people are afraid of because they don't know the name. So those of us who are making programs take the responsibility to give people what they're familiar with, what they're comfortable with, but to challenge them and give them something new, even when that something new is something old. It was revelatory last summer. The violinist Daniel Phillips did a whole group of violin sonatas pre-Bach by the composer Heinrich Bieber, not to be confused with any other. and these were just revolutionary, extraordinary pieces that people hadn't heard before. It was one of the things that, as someone who programs concerts, gets to experience is having great musicians with a vast depth of experience bring ideas and repertoire ideas to me. And so Danny Phillips told me about these sonatas, and we programmed that music, and people went nuts to hear something that would just grab them and was so exciting that they'd never heard before, that's been around for centuries.
And what about at the other end of the spectrum? What do you think about new music and programming that, or introducing audiences to the future of music, if you will?
Well, that is a responsibility that is very, very profound, and that I always try to share with colleagues that I trust. And there's a segment of the audience that only wants to hear new things. And some of them are very, very demonstrative, both with their attendance at new music concerts and with their philanthropy. There are people who understand that it's not the most popular position to take and have the resources to help. And I've been really honored to know some of the people who will fund commissions and who believe that that's an important aspect of classical music. And introducing those works to a larger audience who might be afraid of it is a challenge, and when it succeeds, it's very gratifying. I think people are realizing that there's no such thing as a characterization of new music. There are so many different styles. Everything that's written in 2014 is influenced by everything that's come before it, and one composer may be influenced by a completely different set of aesthetics than another. So audience members who may have heard a work that was written 2 years ago and say, I don't like new music because I didn't like that piece, is like one of my kids eating a green bean saying, I don't like vegetables.
Yeah.
That's not it.
Yeah.
Because that's not all there is.
Right. No, it's an interesting challenge.
And try it again. Maybe next time you'll like it.
Exactly. A lot of it is communication. Absolutely. I'm going to pause now and see if any of you in the audience have some questions. And if you do, we have a microphone up here, and I invite you to come up and ask your question. Don't be shy. Okay, great.
Is it about midnight?
Yeah. Okay. Walk up.
Hello. Thanks for being here. Can you hear me okay? Okay, good. My question is in today's music world, how do you go about finding presenters, reaching out to presenters that will put your chamber ensemble on their schedules? And the second part of my question is, what role do you think hiring management for chamber ensembles plays in today's music world? I think Tim Gauckland's group, they hired management, and they seem to be doing very well. So I was just wondering if you had any ideas about that.
That's a very good and very specific question. I think you have to, a chamber ensemble that's serious has to prove to itself that it's serious and commit to some kind of a period of time where you might be in the desert for a while. Because there's a definite time lag between an initiative and reaping any kind of results. I think that you mentioned Tim Gocklin and the Acropolis Quintet. They've been working together for quite a few years, and they've made this commitment where even though Tim is living here and some of them are living in Michigan, they fly to wherever they need to be to rehearse, and they prepare and go to competitions. That's how I knew about them. And incidentally, I've engaged that group for the festival in Portland for this coming summer. So it's an interesting example that you brought up with Tim and that quintet. And I heard them as contestants in a competition in Missouri, the Plowman competition at the University of Missouri, about 3 years ago. And it's taken that long until I was able to organize the opportunity to invite them to play at this festival in Portland. That much lead time, 3 years. In the meantime, they've kept themselves busy. They won a few other competitions. They've organized. They've gotten themselves a management. But while you're waiting for those opportunities and preparing for those contests, those are the times, I think, to rehearse, to prepare, to learn how to work with one another, to collaborate, to learn that discourse, that protocol for working well with one another and being collaborative while bringing your best attributes to the group, and finding opportunities and creating opportunities in living rooms and churches and classrooms, and performing and building your repertoire, and having a commitment that is going to be over several years before you can even begin to judge whether you've succeeded or not. As far as managers are concerned, it's a difficult time. There's a tremendous amount of competition. Some of the same things that make it easier to self-promote and self-produce also make the field more crowded because those opportunities are available to everyone. So I think some of the same qualities and attributes that were applicable before the internet and before it became so much less expensive to get your work known on YouTube and everywhere else, some of the same qualities of commitment and patience and being able to persevere and be resilient when things don't go the way you want them to are just as much in effect now. The question of whether to hire a manager or not, it depends entirely on the manager and what the working relationship is. There are some great managers out there who really are committed to discovering talent and bringing them to the public. There are also groups that manage themselves very successfully, and it takes a lot of work. I know that if you heard the Opus 1 piano quartet, it's Ida Kavafian, Stephen Tenenbaum, Anne-Marie McDermott, and Peter Wiley. You have a former member of Tashi, a former member of the Beaux-Arts Quartet, and the Guarneri Quartet have come together to make a piano quartet. And at that point, when they formed, they had played at virtually every major, one of them at least had played for every major chamber music presenter in the country and probably in the world between all of those groups. And they decided that they were going to just manage themselves. And they had a lot of success with a limited amount of availability because they're all so busy. But I think after about 10 years of doing that, Ida Kavafian, who was doing most of the emails and phone calls, might have gotten a little tired of it, but I think she's still doing it. And, if you meet enough people who know your work and believe in what you're doing, then you don't need somebody to sell it for you. But you do need to be able to get your programs out in time and arrange your travel. And many groups do that for themselves and post your information, your biography, and your history, and your high-resolution photos on the internet. So, again, whether to have a manager or not really depends on the manager. If you can win a competition like Young Concert Artists or Concert Artists Guild, where management comes with the deal, it's great. And those are two organizations that are tremendously committed and really do wonders for the groups that win their prize, which comes with management. I was talking about prizes earlier too, and the trajectory and the shelf life. When you have an organization like that follows up with performances and management, then that is really, really valuable. More than a plaque and a check, which is literally shelf life for the plaque and limit on how much you can spend the same check.
Thank you for answering that question, because I get that question all the time. So I'm glad to hear a professional performer give you the advice from the real inside. Who else? Anybody else? Do we have time for another couple of audience questions if somebody has something? So what would be your advice to today's Yale School of Music students on how to create success for themselves going forward?
Listen to your teacher. Be prepared. Practice. Allow yourself the opportunity to fail, because you don't have to win every audition. You just have to win a few. And patience. And the cliche of luck being the intersection of opportunity and preparation has never been more true than it is now. And you have to stay prepared. You have to increase your opportunities by increasing your openness to different types of opportunities. For those of us who decide that they want to be in an orchestra, say, okay, well, I only want to play first clarinet. I'm a first clarinetist, and I'm not even going to audition for second clarinet or bass clarinet or E-flat clarinet. To me, that's limiting unless you're getting offers to do that. Or I only want to be on the East Coast. That's not terribly realistic. You have to be open to, and I think most of the students here know that. You have to be open to living in different places, traveling to different places, doing different kinds of work, and reacting to a certain extent to what opportunities are in your view, and to opening that view as wide as you can to see what else is out there.
I'm going to add two more things that I heard
Please.
you say. Incredible generosity. And that's one thing, that's the word that comes to mind when I think of you, David, because you're always hiring students, referring your friends, creating opportunities for other people. So it seems so second nature to you. And I think those personal qualities are also really important in creating a career and being a good collaborator, being a good colleague, remembering your friends. And
I don't think that's any different in classical music than it is in any profession.
And I think it's something, though, that needs to be said, particularly in, chamber music, which really is a family, a marriage. I've heard it said, called it group therapy, but it's definitely a dynamic. And so the more successful you are at managing relationships, it sounds like that's another very helpful thing. And remembering your friends from whom you went to camp with when you were 13, that seems like another part of the package.
Well, it's a balancing. We each have to have the trust and the responsibility to one another if we're going to work together, that we're going to come prepared and deliver. You don't just hire somebody that you were in the 5th grade with because you were in the 5th grade with them,
Right.
and you want to go on the road and it'll be fun. There has to be the working relationship, and it's tricky sometimes, but it's a great opportunity to keep in contact with people that you care about who have similar interests and similar aspirations.
Right. Great. Well, this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your
Thank
views
you.
with us. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Nice. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Great. Thanks all for coming.